I stood frozen in the doorway of my late mother's dining room, watching my sister-in-law Rebecca shove me aside like I was nothing more than a piece of unwanted furniture cluttering her perfectly organized world. The mahogany chair that had been mine for 37 years, the chair where I had celebrated every birthday, every holiday, every family milestone since I was 15 years old, was suddenly no longer mine according to her twisted logic and inflated sense of entitlement. "Only real family sits here," she announced with a voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, her tone dripping with contempt and superiority as she settled into my seat with a satisfied smirk that made my blood run cold. The room erupted in uncomfortable laughter, my brother Marcus included, and I felt something deep inside me crack and splinter as I stood there trembling, not from fear but from the sheer overwhelming humiliation of being cast aside like garbage in the home where I grew up, the home my mother had poured her heart and soul into for over 4 decades, the home that held every single memory of my childhood and young adulthood. My name is Eleanor Marie Harrison, and for most of my 52 years on this earth, I believed with every fiber of my being that family meant loyalty, meant standing together through thick and thin, meant honoring the bonds that tie us together no matter what storms we faced or what challenges threatened to tear us apart. I was raised to believe that blood was thicker than water, that siblings protected each other, that love conquered all obstacles. My mother Catherine had instilled these values in both Marcus and me from the time we were small children, teaching us to share, to support each other, to always have each other's backs no matter what the world threw at us. She would have been heartbroken to see how far we had fallen from those ideals, how the simple act of her dying had revealed the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath the surface of our family for years. The day my mother passed away after her long and brutal battle with pancreatic cancer was both the saddest and strangest day of my life. I had been by her side in that sterile hospital room for 72 hours straight, holding her hand, whispering words of love and comfort, playing her favorite music softly in the background, making sure she knew she was not alone as she took her final journey. Marcus had called that morning saying he was on his way, that Rebecca and the boys were coming too, that they would be there within the hour. But the hour came and went, and then another, and my mother's breathing became more labored and her grip on my hand grew weaker. I called Marcus 3 times and each time he assured me they were almost there, just stuck in traffic, just 5 minutes away. She died at 3:47 in the afternoon with only me beside her. Marcus and his family arrived at 4:15, a full 28 minutes after she had taken her last breath, and Rebecca's first words were not condolences or expressions of grief but a complaint about the parking situation at the hospital and how much the garage was going to charge them. I remember staring at her in disbelief, my eyes still wet with tears, my hand still warm from holding my mother's now cold fingers, and thinking that surely she could not be this callous, this utterly devoid of basic human empathy. But Marcus just nodded along with her complaints, adding his own frustrations about the traffic and how they had tried to get there in time, but what could they do? I did not say anything in that moment because I was too numb with grief to process the deeper implications of their behavior. I simply stepped back and let them have their moment with my mother's body, watching as Rebecca took a few obligatory photos for social media, as Marcus shed what looked like genuine tears but might have just been exhaustion, as their 2 boys stood awkwardly in the corner looking at their phones because nobody had prepared them for what death actually looked like. The hospital staff was kind and patient, giving us time before they needed to move my mother's body, and I used those moments to say my private goodbyes, to whisper promises that I would honor her memory, to tell her one last time how much she had meant to me and how grateful I was for every sacrifice she had made for us. The funeral planning fell entirely on my shoulders, which was not surprising given that I had been my mother's primary caregiver for the last 3 years of her life. When my mother was first diagnosed, Marcus and Rebecca had expressed appropriate shock and sadness, had promised to be there for whatever we needed, had made all the right noises about family pulling together during difficult times. But as the months wore on and the reality of caregiving became clear, their involvement dwindled to almost nothing. Rebecca claimed she could not handle hospitals and sickness, that they triggered her anxiety and made her physically ill. Marcus said his job was too demanding to take time off, that they were struggling financially with the boys' activities and school expenses, that surely I understood how complicated their lives were. So I became the one who took my mother to every chemotherapy appointment, who sat with her through the nausea and pain, who researched treatment options and clinical trials, who advocated with doctors and insurance companies, who managed her medications and tracked her symptoms. I was the one who moved into her house to provide around-the-clock care when she became too weak to manage on her own. I was the one who gave up my job as a marketing consultant, who put my own life completely on hold, who watched my savings account dwindle as I covered expenses that insurance did not pay. And I did it willingly, lovingly, without resentment, because she was my mother and I could not imagine doing anything else. But there were costs that went beyond the financial. I had been dating a wonderful man named James when my mother was diagnosed, and we had been talking about marriage, about building a life together. But as my caregiving responsibilities increased, our relationship suffered. He tried to be understanding at first, tried to be patient with my cancelled plans and my exhaustion and my inability to think about anything beyond my mother's next doctor appointment. But eventually he said he felt like he was competing with my mother for my attention, that he needed a partner who could actually be present in the relationship, and he ended things 6 months into my mother's illness. I cried for one night and then pushed the pain deep down because I did not have the luxury of wallowing in heartbreak when my mother needed me. I also lost friendships during those 3 years. People who had been in my life for decades slowly drifted away because I was no longer available for brunches or girls' nights or weekend getaways. They sent sympathetic messages at first, promising to be there for me, but as the months turned into years and I remained unavailable, the invitations stopped coming. I understood, truly I did, because nobody wants to be friends with someone who can only talk about cancer treatments and insurance battles and the slow deterioration of a loved one's body and mind. But understanding did not make the loneliness any easier to bear. Meanwhile, Marcus and Rebecca continued living their lives as if nothing had changed. They took vacations to Florida and California, posted photos of their adventures on social media, bought a new SUV, enrolled the boys in expensive sports programs. When I occasionally mentioned feeling overwhelmed or exhausted, Rebecca would say things like, "Well, you chose to take on that responsibility, or maybe you should look into hiring professional help," completely ignoring the fact that professional help cost money we did not have and that I had chosen this responsibility because nobody else was stepping up. The last 6 months of my mother's life were the hardest. The cancer had spread to her liver and bones, and the pain became nearly impossible to manage even with the strongest medications. She was in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in morphine-induced dreams. During her lucid moments, she would talk about her life, her regrets, her hopes for Marcus and me. She talked about my father, who had died 15 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, and how much she missed him. She talked about her own parents and her childhood, stories I had heard 100 times but listened to as if hearing them for the first time because I knew these were the last tellings. And she talked about her will. This made me uncomfortable because I did not want her thinking about death, did not want to face the reality that our time together was running out. But she insisted, saying she needed me to understand her decisions, needed me to know that everything she was doing was done with love and careful thought. She told me that she had updated her will recently, that her attorney George Patterson had come to the house several times to make sure everything was exactly as she wanted it. She said there were going to be people who would be unhappy with her choices, but she needed me to trust that she knew what she was doing. I tried to tell her that it did not matter, that I did not care about inheritance or money or any of that I just wanted her to be comfortable and at peace. But she grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Eleanor, you have given up everything for me. You have sacrificed your career, your relationships, your own happiness to make sure I did not suffer alone. I cannot let that go unrecognized. I cannot let you walk away from these years with nothing to show for your devotion. Promise me you will accept what I am giving you without guilt. Promise me you will use it to build the life you deserve." I promised, even though I did not fully understand what she meant, even though part of me felt guilty for even discussing inheritance while she was still alive. But I could see how important it was to her, how much she needed to know that her affairs were in order and that I would be taken care of after she was gone. So I promised, and she relaxed back into her pillows with a small smile of satisfaction, and I went back to the endless tasks of caregiving, pushing our conversation to the back of my mind. Marcus visited 3 times during those final 6 months. 3 times in 180 days. Each visit lasted less than an hour, and each time Rebecca came with him, hovering in the doorway like she was afraid to get too close to death, making comments about how sad it all was while simultaneously checking her phone and clearly wishing she was anywhere else. The boys came once, and I could see they were uncomfortable and scared, and I tried to make it easier for them by taking them out to the garden while Marcus and Rebecca had their brief visit with my mother. After one of these visits, after they had left and I was cleaning up the teacups and adjusting my mother's pillows, she said something that struck me as odd at the time. She said, "Eleanor, be careful with Rebecca. I have seen how she looks at this house, how she calculates and plans. She has been asking Marcus questions about my finances, about property values, about what happens to assets when someone dies. I do not trust her intentions." I tried to brush it off, saying that Rebecca was probably just being practical, just trying to understand the situation. But my mother shook her head and said no, it is more than that. She sees dollar signs where she should see family. Just be careful. I wish I had paid more attention to that warning. I wish I had recognized it for what it was, a mother's intuition about danger ahead. But I was so consumed with the daily realities of caregiving, with managing pain medications and doctor appointments and insurance claims, that I did not have the mental energy to worry about Rebecca's potential scheming. That was a mistake I would come to regret. The funeral was held on a grey Tuesday morning in late October, with leaves falling from the trees in my mother's beloved garden and a cold wind that cut through even the thickest coats. I had spent 2 weeks planning every detail, choosing the music she had loved, selecting readings that reflected her values and beliefs, arranging flowers in her favorite colors. I had written and rewritten the eulogy a dozen times, trying to capture the essence of who she had been, trying to honor her memory in a way that would make her proud. Marcus had asked if he should speak as well, but when I started helping him outline what he might say, he became overwhelmed and said he just could not do it, that he was too emotional, that maybe it was better if I handled it alone. The church was full, which surprised me because my mother had been so sick for so long that I thought people might have forgotten about her. But they came, her friends from book club and church, her former colleagues from the library where she had worked for 30 years, neighbors who remembered her kindness and generosity, distant relatives I had not seen in years. They shared stories about my mother that made me laugh and cry, stories that reminded me she had been more than just my mother. She had been a whole person with a full life that extended far beyond her role in my existence. Rebecca showed up late, making a grand entrance in a black designer dress and oversized sunglasses that she kept on throughout the entire service despite being indoors. She sat in the front row beside Marcus and spent most of the funeral on her phone, not even trying to hide what she was doing. Several people noticed and I saw them exchanging disapproving glances, but nobody said anything because what do you say to someone who is so obviously disrespectful at a funeral? Marcus seemed oblivious or perhaps just resigned to her behavior, his attention focused on trying to keep the boys quiet and still. I delivered the eulogy with tears streaming down my face, my voice breaking multiple times, but I got through it. I talked about my mother's strength and kindness, her love of reading and gardening, her fierce protection of her children, her grace in facing death. I talked about the lessons she had taught me about compassion and perseverance and unconditional love. I did not mention that only one of her children had been there to learn those final lessons, that only one of her children had held her hand as she died, that only one of her children had sacrificed everything to ensure her comfort and dignity. But everyone in that church knew. They had seen me during those 3 years, exhausted and devoted, and they knew. After the service, we gathered at my mother's house for the traditional post-funeral reception. I had arranged for catering because I knew I would not have the energy to cook, and several of my mother's friends had brought dishes anyway, casseroles and desserts and salads, the traditional foods of grief. People filled the house, sharing memories and offering condolences, and for a few hours it almost felt like old times when my mother would host holiday gatherings and the house would be full of life and laughter. But then I noticed Rebecca. She was not with the other guests sharing stories and eating casseroles. She was going through the house room by room, opening closets and drawers, examining items, taking photographs. At first I thought maybe she was just overwhelmed and needed some space, but then I saw her in my mother's bedroom, going through the jewelry box, holding up pieces and examining them in the light, clearly appraising their value. I walked in and asked her what she was doing, and she looked at me without a trace of embarrassment and said that someone needed to start cataloging my mother's valuables, that these things needed to be documented for estate purposes. I told her that could wait, that we had just buried my mother and maybe we could take one day to grieve before we started dividing up her possessions. Rebecca gave me a look that I can only describe as contemptuous and said that grief did not pay the bills, that Marcus's family had financial obligations, that the sooner we got the estate settled the better for everyone. She said it like I was being naive or overly sentimental, like I was the one being inappropriate instead of her. I wanted to scream at her, wanted to physically remove her from my mother's bedroom, but I was so exhausted and emotionally drained that I just walked away, returning to the living room where at least people were being respectful. Over the next 2 weeks, Rebecca's behavior became increasingly aggressive. She showed up at the house almost daily, always with some excuse about needing to pick up this or that, but really she was conducting an inventory of everything my mother owned. She made lists of furniture and artwork, researched the value of antiques online, even contacted a real estate agent to get an appraisal of the house. When I asked her to please wait until after the will was read, she said she was just being prepared, just making sure they understood what they were dealing with, just protecting her family's interests. Her family's interests. Not our family. Not Marcus and Eleanor and the memory of our mother. Her family, meaning her and Marcus and their sons, as if I was somehow not part of the equation at all. It was during one of these inventory sessions that she started making comments about how much the house was worth, how it was sitting in a prime location, how Marcus deserved his fair share after all these years, how his children's education had to be considered. She never once mentioned my sacrifices or my caregiving or the fact that I had given up 3 years of my life while she had given up nothing. The reading of the will was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral, which felt like an eternity given Rebecca's increasingly predatory behavior. George Patterson, my mother's attorney, had called me personally to confirm the date and time, and there was something in his tone that made me both nervous and curious. He said he wanted to make sure both Marcus and I would be there in person, that this was not something that could be handled over the phone or through email. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that my mother had left very specific instructions about how the reading should be conducted and who should be present. The night before the reading, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my mother's words, about her warning to be careful with Rebecca, about her insistence that I promise to accept her gifts without guilt. I wondered what she had decided, how she had chosen to divide her estate, whether she had tried to be fair or whether she had acknowledged the reality of who had been there for her and who had not. Part of me hoped she had split everything evenly because I did not want to be the cause of family conflict. But another part of me, a part one was almost ashamed to acknowledge, hoped she had recognized my devotion and rewarded it accordingly. The morning of the reading, I woke up with a knot of anxiety in my stomach that no amount of tea or deep breathing could ease. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress and the pearl earrings my mother had given me for my 30th birthday, the ones she had received from her own mother on her wedding day. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a woman who looked older than her 52 years, with gray streaking through her brown hair and lines of exhaustion around her eyes, evidence of the toll the last 3 years had taken. But I also saw strength there, resilience, the same determination that had gotten me through the darkest days of my mother's illness. I arrived at my mother's house exactly on time, and I immediately noticed that Rebecca's car was already parked in the driveway, not just parked but taking up the space where my mother had always parked, as if Rebecca was already claiming ownership of the property. The garden that my mother had tended with such love and care was showing signs of neglect, with weeds creeping through the flower beds and the roses looking dry and desperate for water. It had only been 3 weeks since the funeral, but already the house looked sad, like it knew its mistress was gone and was grieving in its own way. I let myself in with my key, the key I had carried for years, the key that had allowed me to come and go freely during my mother's illness. Inside, the house smelled different, missing the scent of my mother's lavender sachets and the bread she used to bake on Sunday mornings. Instead it smelled like Rebecca's expensive perfume, a scent that seemed to have permeated every room despite her relatively brief visits. I followed the sound of voices to the dining room and found Rebecca had completely taken over the space. She had pushed the furniture around to create what looked like a conference room, with papers spread across the antique dining table that had been in my mother's family for 4 generations. She had her laptop open and was on the phone discussing something about property values and market conditions, her voice loud and businesslike, completely inappropriate for what should have been a solemn occasion. Marcus sat beside her looking uncomfortable but saying nothing, his eyes downcast, his shoulders hunched. When I entered the room he looked up and gave me a weak smile that did not reach his eyes, A smile that said he knew this was wrong but did not have the courage to do anything about it. I moved toward my usual chair, the chair I had sat in for family dinners and holiday meals and important conversations for 37 years. It was positioned at a slight angle to catch the light from the window, and my mother had always made sure there was a cushion there because she knew I had back problems. That chair held 1,000 memories, from childhood birthday celebrations to teenage heart-to-heart talks to adult discussions about life and death and everything in between. It was my chair, and everyone in the family knew it. But before I could even pull it out, Rebecca ended her phone call and stood up, moving deliberately to block my path. She looked at me with an expression of pure disdain, her lip curled in what could only be described as a sneer, and then she spoke the words that would change everything. "Only real family sits here." She said it loudly, clearly, making sure everyone in the room heard her claim my chair, my space, my place in the family hierarchy. Then she physically pushed past me, her shoulder hitting mine with enough force to make me stumble backward, and she settled into my chair with a satisfied smirk that made my hands clench into fists at my sides. The few distant relatives who had gathered for the reading, cousins and second cousins who barely knew my mother but showed up for occasions like this, reacted with uncomfortable laughter. Some of them were genuinely amused, thinking this was some kind of family joke they did not quite understand. Others laughed nervously, recognizing the cruelty but not wanting to get involved. Marcus, my brother, the person who should have defended me, who should have told his wife that she was being completely inappropriate and disrespectful, just looked at his hands and said nothing. I stood there frozen, my face burning with humiliation, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to say something cutting and brilliant, wanted to put Rebecca in her place with the perfect comeback that would make everyone see her for what she truly was. But my mind was blank, overwhelmed by the shock of such blatant disrespect, such casual cruelty. So I did the only thing I could do in that moment. I moved to an empty chair at the far end of the table, a chair that had always been reserved for guests, and I sat down feeling like a stranger in the house where I had grown up. Rebecca had won this round, and she knew it. She leaned back in my chair, my mother's chair, the chair that should have been a symbol of family continuity and love, and she smiled like a cat that had caught a particularly satisfying mouse. She opened her laptop and started typing, making a show of being busy and important, making sure everyone knew she was in charge now. Marcus glanced at me once, and I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but he quickly looked away and the moment passed. George Patterson arrived about 10 minutes later, his leather briefcase in hand and his expression carefully neutral. But I saw his eyes sweep the room, taking in the rearranged furniture and the tension that hung in the air like fog. His gaze lingered on Rebecca sitting in my chair, then moved to me sitting at the end of the table like an afterthought, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. George had known our family for over 20 years. He had been my mother's attorney through my father's death, through estate planning and business matters and personal legal issues. He knew the dynamics, knew the history, knew who had been there and who had not. He greeted everyone formally and professionally, shaking hands and offering condolences, then placed his briefcase on the table and asked if everyone was ready to begin. Rebecca answered before anyone else could speak, her voice sharp and impatient. "Yes, we are ready to hear about the inheritance. Can we please move this along? I have several appointments this afternoon, and I cannot spend all day here." She said this as if the reading of my mother's will was an inconvenience, as if this legal proceeding that would determine the distribution of a lifetime's worth of assets was just another item on her busy schedule. George's expression remained neutral, but his eyes went cold. He replied in a measured tone that this process would take as long as it needed to take, that my mother's wishes deserved to be heard and respected, and that anyone who could not spare the time was welcome to leave and receive the information through their own attorney. Rebecca bristled at this, clearly not used to being challenged, but she settled back in her chair and gestured for him to continue. Before George could open his briefcase, Rebecca pulled out her own folder of papers and announced that she had already consulted with her own attorney about estate law and inheritance rights. She wanted to make sure, she said with a pointed look at me, that everything was done properly and legally, that there were no irregularities or attempts to manipulate the distribution. The implication was clear. She was worried that I had somehow influenced my mother, that I had used my position as caregiver to gain an unfair advantage. It was insulting and hurtful and completely baseless, but that did not stop her from planting the seed of doubt in everyone's minds. George assured her that everything had been done according to the highest legal standards, that my mother had been of sound mind and had made her decisions freely and without any undue influence from anyone. He said this with emphasis on the word anyone, and I wondered if he knew something about Rebecca's behavior that I did not. Then he opened his briefcase and removed a thick envelope containing my mother's will, along with several other documents that looked official and important. The first part of the will covered the standard legal language, establishing my mother's identity and confirming that this document superseded all previous wills and codicils. George read through this section relatively quickly, and I could see Rebecca's leg bouncing impatiently under the table, her fingers drumming on the wood surface. Then he moved on to the section covering funeral arrangements and final wishes, most of which I had already carried out exactly as my mother had specified. She had wanted a church service with specific hymns, burial in the family plot next to my father, and a reception at the house. She had even specified the flowers, white roses and blue hydrangeas, her favorites. Next came the distribution of personal property, and this was where things started to get interesting. My mother had left specific items to specific people, and George read through the list carefully. To my dear friend Martha Wilson, I leave my collection of first edition mystery novels, knowing she will treasure them as I have. To my neighbor Robert Chin, I leave my gardening tools and the antique watering can, in thanks for his help maintaining my garden during my illness. To my cousin Patricia, I leave the silver tea service that came from our grandmother. And then he started reading the items designated for me. To my daughter Eleanor, I leave my wedding ring and engagement ring, to be worn or kept as she sees fit, along with all of my personal jewelry except where otherwise specified. I leave her my hope chest with all of its contents, my collection of recipe books with my handwritten notes, my photo albums and scrapbooks, my mother's china pattern, and all personal correspondence and journals. Rebecca's face had been getting darker with each item George listed, and when he mentioned the rings, she actually slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make the laptop jump. "Why are the rings going to her?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Those rings should go to Marcus as the oldest child, as the one who will pass them down to his sons, the next generation. This is completely inappropriate." George calmly explained that jewelry typically passes through the female line unless otherwise specified, and that my mother had the right to distribute her personal property as she saw fit. But Rebecca was not satisfied. She argued that the rings had significant monetary value, that they should be considered part of the estate's assets and divided accordingly. Marcus finally spoke up, putting a hand on Rebecca's arm and telling her to calm down, that they should let George finish before making objections. Rebecca shook off his hand angrily but settled back, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression murderous. George continued reading, listing more personal items, small monetary gifts to various charities my mother had supported over the years, specific amounts to be donated to the Cancer Research Foundation and the local library and the animal shelter where she had volunteered before getting sick. Then George paused. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each person present, and I felt my heart start to race because I knew we were about to get to the important part, the part that would determine everything. He took a breath and said that he was now moving on to the distribution of the major assets, specifically the house and the investment portfolio and savings accounts that comprised the bulk of my mother's estate. The room went completely silent. Even Rebecca stopped fidgeting. Everyone leaned forward slightly, and I could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. George began to read, his voice steady and clear. "I bequeath my home at 1847 Maple Street, including all property, buildings, and land therein, along with the entirety of my investment portfolio held at Merrill Lynch under account number ending in 4782, and all savings accounts held at First National Bank under accounts ending in 9234 and 5671, to my daughter Eleanor Marie Harrison, in recognition of her unwavering dedication, her profound sacrifices, and her unconditional love during the most difficult years of my life." The words hung in the air for a moment, not quite real, not quite believable. I felt like I was underwater, like sound was coming from very far away. I saw George's mouth moving, saw Rebecca's face transform from confusion to shock to absolute rage, but it all seemed to be happening in slow motion, in some alternate reality that could not possibly be real. Then Rebecca exploded. She shot to her feet so fast that the chair, my chair, tipped over backward and crashed to the floor with a sound like thunder. "That is impossible!" she screamed, her face going from white to red to purple in rapid succession. "That house is worth at least $700,000, probably more in this market. And the investments, the savings, that has to be at least another $300,000. You are telling me that she is getting over $1 million while Marcus gets nothing? His own mother left him nothing?" George remained completely calm, his hands folded on the table, his expression professionally sympathetic but firm. He explained that the will was perfectly legal, had been drawn up with sound mind and proper witnesses, and that my mother had actually updated it just 6 months before her death to ensure it reflected her current wishes. He had discussed it with her at length, he said, to make absolutely certain she understood the implications and was comfortable with her decisions. There was no question of competency, no question of undue influence, no question of validity. But Rebecca was beyond reason. She started pacing the room, her expensive heels clicking on the hardwood floor that my mother had refinished 5 years ago. "This is completely unfair," she ranted. "Marcus is the oldest child. He is the son. He has children of his own to provide for, college tuitions to save for, a future to plan. What does Eleanor have? No husband, no children, no responsibilities. She does not need this money. This is clearly a case of manipulation. She obviously poisoned Catherine against us, made herself look like the perfect daughter while painting us as villains. I always knew she was manipulative, but this is a new low even for her." I sat there listening to her tirade, feeling strangely detached from the whole scene, like I was watching a play rather than participating in my own life. Part of me wanted to defend myself, to point out that I had not manipulated anyone, that I had simply been there when my mother needed someone. But another part of me knew that nothing I said would make any difference, that Rebecca had already constructed her own narrative, and no amount of truth would penetrate her delusions. Marcus looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. He had stood up when Rebecca knocked over the chair, and now he stood beside her looking helpless and ashamed. I could see the conflict on his face, the part of him that knew this was wrong and the part of him that was too afraid of his wife to say anything. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and uncertain. "Rebecca, maybe we should calm down and let George finish. Maybe there is more to the will that explains things." George nodded and said that yes, there was indeed more. My mother had also left a letter explaining her decisions, and he thought it would be helpful for everyone to hear it. But Rebecca was not interested in explanations. She said she wanted to consult with her own attorney immediately, that she was not going to sit here and be robbed of her children's inheritance, that she would contest this will and tie it up in court for years if necessary. George warned her that contesting a will was expensive and time-consuming and rarely successful, especially when the document was as thoroughly prepared as this one. But Rebecca just grabbed her folder and her laptop and her purse and headed for the door. Before she left, she stopped and turned back to me, and the look she gave me was pure hatred. "You think you have won," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "You think you can just waltz in here and steal what rightfully belongs to my family. But I know the truth about you, Eleanor. I know how you manipulated her, how you isolated her from us, how you poisoned her mind against her own son. You are pathetic and desperate, and you should be ashamed of yourself. This is not over. Not by a long shot. Do you hear me? This is not over." And with that dramatic exit, she was gone, the front door slamming behind her so hard that a framed photograph fell off the wall in the hallway and the glass shattered across the floor. Marcus stood there for a moment looking torn, looking like he might actually stay and have a conversation with me, but then he shook his head and muttered something about needing to go after her, and he left too, leaving me alone with George and the handful of relatives who had witnessed the whole ugly scene. Nobody knew what to say. The relatives started gathering their things and making excuses about needing to leave, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama they had just witnessed. Within minutes, the room had cleared except for George and me. He came around the table and put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Your mother knew this would be difficult," he said quietly. "That is why she made absolutely certain that everything was legally airtight. She documented everything, Eleanor. She made video recordings explaining her decisions. She had her doctors attest to her mental competency. She anticipated every possible objection Rebecca might raise, and she addressed them all. I nodded, still feeling numb, still struggling to process everything that had just happened. George reached into his briefcase and pulled out another envelope, this one smaller and more personal, with my name written in my mother's elegant handwriting. She asked me to give you this in private. After the reading, he said. I am going to step outside and make some phone calls to give you time to read it. Then we will discuss the practical next steps. He squeezed my shoulder once more and then left, closing the door quietly behind him. I sat there holding the envelope, tracing my mother's handwriting with my finger, not quite ready to open it and face whatever emotions it contained. The house was quiet around me, so quiet I could hear the old clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock that had marked the hours of my childhood, the same clock that had ticked away the minutes of my mother's final days. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the envelope, unfolding the pages of cream-colored stationery covered in my mother's familiar script. My darling Eleanor, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I imagine the reading of my will has just taken place. I also imagine that Rebecca reacted poorly, and that you are probably feeling confused and guilty and overwhelmed. Please know that every decision I made was made with love and careful consideration, and I need you to hear me out before you let guilt or family pressure make you doubt yourself. The letter continued for several pages, and with each paragraph I felt my mother's presence more strongly, as if she was sitting right there beside me speaking the words aloud. She wrote about watching me sacrifice my life for her care, about seeing me put everything on hold without complaint or resentment. She wrote about how it broke her heart to watch me lose relationships and friendships, to see me age before my time under the weight of caregiving responsibilities, to witness my exhaustion and loneliness but never my bitterness. She wrote that she had tried to get Marcus more involved, had called him multiple times asking him to come help, to give me a break, to share the burden of her care. But every time she called, Rebecca would answer and make excuses, would say they were too busy or the boys had activities or Marcus was stressed at work. She wrote about a particularly painful conversation she had with Marcus about 6 months before she died, during one of his rare visits. She had asked him directly why he came so infrequently, why he left all the caregiving to me, why he seemed so distant and disconnected. Marcus had broken down and admitted that Rebecca did not want him spending time at the house, that she said it was depressing and morbid, that she complained every time he mentioned visiting. He had cried and apologized, but then he had left and nothing changed. My mother wrote that it was in that moment she decided to update her will, that she realized Marcus was not the person making decisions in his own life anymore, that Rebecca had taken control of everything including his relationship with his dying mother. My mother went on to explain her reasoning for leaving me the house and the majority of her assets. She wrote that the house held our family history, our memories, the essence of who we were as a family, and she could not bear the thought of Rebecca selling it to the highest bidder and erasing all those years of love and life. She knew I would preserve it, honor it, maybe even live in it and create new memories within its walls. As for the financial assets, she had calculated exactly how much I had lost by giving up my career to care for her. She had tracked the income one would have earned as a marketing consultant, the retirement contributions I had missed, the career advancement I had sacrificed. The amount came to roughly $280,000 over 3 years, and she wanted to make sure I had the resources to rebuild my life after her death. But there was more to the letter, details I had not expected. My mother revealed that about a year before she died, Rebecca had come to visit her alone, without Marcus. This was unusual enough that my mother immediately felt suspicious. Rebecca had brought documents, power of attorney papers, and had tried to convince my mother to sign them, saying it would make things easier for everyone, that Marcus could handle all her financial affairs and I would not have to worry about anything beyond the physical caregiving. My mother had refused, had told Rebecca she already had all her legal affairs in order with George Patterson, but Rebecca had persisted, becoming aggressive and accusatory. My mother wrote that Rebecca had actually said that it was not fair for me to have so much control over the situation, that as the son Marcus deserved to be more involved in the financial decisions, that signing over power of attorney was just common sense. When my mother continued to refuse, Rebecca's demeanor changed completely. She had said that my mother was being manipulated by me, that I was obviously influencing her decisions to benefit myself, that this would all come out eventually and everyone would see me for the gold digger I really was. My mother had been so disturbed by this conversation that she had called George immediately afterward and asked him to come to the house the next day. That was when my mother had updated her will, adding even more protections and documentation. She had also hired a private investigator, something I had no idea about, to look into Rebecca's background and behavior. The investigator's report had revealed some troubling information. Rebecca had significant credit card debt that Marcus did not know about. Nearly $40,000 spread across multiple cards. She had taken out a personal loan using Marcus's signature, a loan he had not authorized and might not even know existed. She had been making inquiries about reverse mortgages and home equity loans on my mother's house, despite having no legal authority to do so. The investigator had also interviewed neighbors and found that Rebecca had been coming to the house when Marcus was at work and I was at medical appointments with my mother. She had been taking small items, testing the waters to see what she could get away with. Mrs. Chen next door had actually confronted her once, seeing her carry out a box of my mother's china, and Rebecca had claimed my mother had given it to her, which was a lie. Mrs. Chen had told my mother about this incident, and my mother had installed security cameras, footage from which was now in George's possession showing Rebecca entering the house multiple times and removing items without permission. Reading all of this, I felt sick. I had known Rebecca was difficult and self-centered, but I had not realized the extent of her deception and manipulation. My mother's letter continued, and her tone shifted from factual reporting to emotional appeal. Eleanor, you need to understand that this inheritance is not a gift or a reward. It is restitution for what you sacrificed. It is recognition of your worth and your devotion. It is my attempt to give you back some of what you lost by loving me so completely. Please do not let Rebecca's poison make you doubt yourself or feel guilty for accepting what you have earned through years of selfless service. She wrote about her hopes for my future, about wanting me to use the resources she was leaving me to finally pursue my own dreams and build my own life. She wanted me to travel, to go back to school if I wanted, to find love again, to experience all the things I had put on hold. She wrote that the house was mine to keep or sell as I saw fit, that she would understand either decision because she trusted my judgment completely. She hoped I would keep it because it would give her peace to know that our family home remained in loving hands, but she emphasized that the choice was entirely mine to make. The letter closed with words that made me sob openly, my tears falling onto the paper and smudging the ink. You have been the best daughter any mother could hope for, and I am so proud of the woman you are. You have shown strength and grace and compassion even in the darkest times. You have honored your father's memory and my love with every sacrifice you made. Please, my darling girl, honor my final wish by accepting this inheritance without guilt, by using it to build the beautiful life you deserve, and by knowing that every single day of care you gave me was a precious gift that I treasured beyond measure. I love you eternally, Mom. I sat there crying for a long time, the letter clutched to my chest, feeling my mother's love surrounding me like a warm blanket. Eventually George came back in, took one look at my tear-stained face, and quietly handed me a box of tissues. He sat down across from me and waited patiently while I composed myself. When I could finally speak, I asked him about the investigator's report, about the evidence of Rebecca's theft and deception. He nodded and said that everything was documented and ready to use if Rebecca followed through on her threat to contest the will. George explained what would happen next. The house was already legally mine as of the moment the will was read. The deed had been prepared in advance and just needed to be filed with the county, which he would handle immediately. The investment accounts and savings accounts would be transferred to my name within 2 to 3 weeks, a standard timeline for estate processing. There was also something I had not known about, a life insurance policy worth $150,000 with me as the sole beneficiary, which would be paid out separately from the estate. As for Marcus, my mother had not completely left him out. There was a trust fund containing $50,000, but it came with conditions. Marcus would receive the money only after completing a series of requirements designed to ensure he was making his own decisions and managing his finances responsibly. He had to attend financial counseling sessions for 6 months. He had to provide documentation that he had separated his finances from Rebecca's, establishing his own accounts that she could not access. He had to demonstrate that he understood the terms of the trust and was not being coerced or manipulated by his wife. Only after meeting all these conditions would the funds be released to him. George said my mother had structured it this way because she still loved Marcus and wanted to help him, but she also wanted to protect him from Rebecca's financial predation. She hoped that the requirements would serve as a wake-up call, that Marcus would be forced to confront the unhealthy dynamics of his marriage and take steps to establish his own autonomy. It was tough love, George explained, but it came from a place of genuine concern for her son's well-being. I asked George about the likelihood of Rebecca successfully contesting the will. He was quiet for a moment, then said that based on the evidence and documentation my mother had assembled, he would put the chances at less than 5%. My mother had been thorough and strategic, anticipating every possible argument Rebecca might make. But he warned me that even a frivolous contest could drag on for months and cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. He assured me that he would defend the will vigorously and that my mother had set aside funds specifically to cover legal expenses if needed. That night I went home to my small apartment, the place I had been renting for the past 3 years while caring for my mother. It was tiny and plain, just a bedroom and bathroom and a combined living room and kitchen, barely 700 square feet. But it had been convenient, located just 10 minutes from my mother's house, allowing me to get there quickly whenever she needed me. I had not bothered to decorate much because I spent so little time there, usually just sleeping a few hours before heading back to my mother's house for another day of caregiving. I looked around at the bare walls and the second-hand furniture and the general sense of temporariness, and I realized this had been my life for 3 years. I had put everything on hold, living in this liminal space, waiting for the inevitable end. And now the end had come, and I had to figure out what came next. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, I could think about my own future, my own desires, my own needs. But I had been in caretaker mode for so long that I did not even know what I wanted anymore. I spent the weekend reading and rereading my mother's letter, letting her words sink into my soul. I also started going through the boxes of personal items George had given me, the jewelry and photo albums and journals my mother had left to me. Each item held memories, stories, connections to a past that suddenly felt both very close and very far away. I found my grandmother's engagement ring, a delicate gold band with a small diamond that sparkled in the light. I found photographs from my parents' wedding, my mother so young and beautiful in her white dress, my father handsome and proud in his suit. I found my mother's journals, years of entries documenting her thoughts and experiences. I was hesitant to read them at first, feeling like I was invading her privacy, but then I remembered she had specifically left them to me, had wanted me to have them. So I started reading, beginning with the earliest entries from when she was a young woman, before she married my father, before Marcus and I were born. She wrote about her dreams and fears, her hopes for the future, her observations about the world around her. She was funny and insightful and occasionally heartbreakingly vulnerable. As I read through the years, I watched my parents' love story unfold on the pages. I read about their first date, their courtship, my father's proposal. I read about their wedding day, about how nervous my mother had been but how right it had felt when she walked down the aisle and saw my father waiting for her. I read about their early years of marriage, the struggles and joys of building a life together. And then I read about Marcus's birth, about my mother's overwhelming love for her firstborn son, about her hopes and dreams for him. A few years later came the entries about my arrival. My mother wrote about how Marcus had been jealous at first, how he had acted out seeking attention, but how he eventually came to love his baby sister. She wrote about our childhood, about Christmas mornings and summer vacations, about scraped knees and hurt feelings, about the ordinary miracles of raising children. Reading these entries made me cry because they reminded me of a time when our family was whole and happy, when Marcus and I were close, when love and laughter filled the house on Maple Street. But as the journals progressed through the years, I noticed a shift. After my father died, my mother's entries became sadder, more introspective. She wrote about her grief and loneliness, about struggling to find purpose after losing her partner of 35 years. She wrote about how I had stepped up to help her through the worst of it, how I had checked on her daily, had helped with finances and household repairs, had made sure she ate and took care of herself. And she wrote about Marcus pulling away, getting more distant, visiting less frequently. The really painful entries started about 5 years ago, shortly after Marcus married Rebecca. My mother wrote about her initial hopes for the marriage, about thinking Rebecca seemed nice enough and hoping she would make Marcus happy. But those hopes quickly faded as Rebecca's true personality emerged. My mother wrote about feeling excluded from Marcus's life, about phone calls that went unreturned, about invitations that were declined, about holidays celebrated without her. She wrote about Rebecca's critical comments and passive-aggressive behavior, about feeling judged and found wanting in her daughter-in-law's eyes. There was an entry from about 3 years ago, right around the time my mother was diagnosed with cancer, that particularly stood out. My mother wrote about calling Marcus to tell him about the diagnosis, about how Rebecca had answered the phone and her immediate response had been to ask about health insurance and whether my mother had enough coverage to handle the medical expenses. Not how are you feeling or what can we do to help, but questions about money and logistics. My mother had been hurt but tried to give Rebecca the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe she was just trying to be practical. But the entries that followed painted a clear picture of Rebecca's increasing hostility and greed. My mother documented every troubling interaction, every suspicious question, every moment when Rebecca's mask slipped and her true motivations showed through. She wrote about Rebecca's constant inquiries about property values and inheritance laws, about her suggestions that my mother sell the house and move into assisted living so the equity could be put to better use. She wrote about Rebecca's complaints that I had too much influence, that I was probably taking advantage of my position as caregiver to manipulate my mother. The final year of entries was the hardest to read. My mother wrote candidly about her physical decline, about the pain and indignity of dying, about her fears and regrets. But she also wrote about gratitude, about how my presence made everything bearable, about how she could face death with peace because she knew she was loved. She wrote specific entries about our conversations and shared moments, things I had forgotten or not fully appreciated at the time. Reading about these moments through her eyes made me realize just how much my care had meant to her, how much comfort I had provided simply by being there. There was an entry from just 2 weeks before she died that made me completely break down. My mother had written, "Eleanor came today and found me crying from the pain. She held me and rocked me like I was a child, singing the lullaby I used to sing to her when she was small. She did not try to fix it or make platitudes about everything being okay. She just loved me through it, and for those moments the pain did not matter because I was held in such perfect love. This is what it means to truly care for someone. Rebecca will never understand this because she has never loved anyone more than she loves money and status. But Eleanor understands, and I am so grateful." On Monday morning, George called to tell me that, as expected, Rebecca had filed papers to contest the will. She was claiming that my mother had been mentally incompetent due to her illness and medications, and that I had exercised undue influence to manipulate the distribution of assets. George said not to worry, that we had overwhelming evidence to refute both claims, but that I should prepare myself for a long and ugly battle. He said Rebecca had hired a notoriously aggressive probate attorney named Donald Sutherland, who specialized in estate contests, and had a reputation for dragging cases out as long as possible to pressure opponents into settling. The next few months were absolutely brutal. Rebecca's attorney sent constant requests for documentation, deposing everyone who had been involved in my mother's care. He questioned my mother's doctors, trying to get them to say she had been confused or cognitively impaired. But every single doctor stated clearly that while my mother had been in physical pain and on pain medications, her mind had remained sharp until the very end. They produced medical records showing her cognitive function tests, her ability to make complex decisions, her clear understanding of her financial situation and estate planning choices. The attorney deposed neighbors and friends, trying to find someone who would say I had isolated my mother or prevented others from visiting. But every person testified the opposite, that I had encouraged visits, that I had kept everyone informed about my mother's condition, that I had been the one facilitating communication and connection. Mrs. Chen from next door gave particularly powerful testimony about watching me care for my mother with such dedication, about how she had never seen anyone work so hard or sacrifice so much for a loved one. She also testified about seeing Rebecca remove items from the house without permission, providing dates and details that corroborated the investigator's report. Rebecca's attorney tried to paint me as a failed career woman who had latched onto my mother for financial security, implying that my caregiving was strategic rather than loving. This strategy backfired when George produced my employment records and tax returns showing that I had been a successful consultant earning nearly $90,000 a year before I gave it all up to care for my mother. He showed the timeline of my declining income and how it corresponded exactly with my mother's diagnosis and increasing care needs. He also produced statements from my former clients and colleagues attesting to my professional reputation and the opportunities one had turned down to prioritize caregiving. The most painful part of the process was Marcus's deposition. He was called to testify about our family dynamics, our mother's mental state, and whether he believed I had manipulated her. I was not present for the deposition, but George provided me with a transcript afterward, and reading it was like watching my brother's soul lay bare on the pages. Under oath, with his own attorney present, Marcus had to confront truths he had been avoiding for years. When asked about his mother's mental competency, Marcus testified that she had always been sharp and clear-minded, that even in her final weeks she had known exactly what she wanted and had expressed it clearly. When asked about his visiting frequency, he admitted he had only visited 3 times in the final 6 months of her life. When asked why so infrequently, he hesitated for a long time before admitting that Rebecca had discouraged visits, had said they were too upsetting, had complained every time he mentioned going to see his dying mother. The attorney then asked about the power of attorney documents Rebecca had tried to get my mother to sign. Marcus's response shocked everyone in the room. He said he had not known about those documents, that Rebecca had never mentioned them to him, that he had no idea she had gone to visit my mother alone with legal papers. The attorney showed him copies of the documents, which included his name as the proposed power of attorney, and Marcus broke down, realizing that Rebecca had forged his signature on the forms. He testified that the signature looked similar to his, but he had definitely not signed those papers, that Rebecca must have practiced copying his signature. This revelation changed everything. Forgery was a crime, and George immediately filed an amended response to include this information. He also reported it to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. Rebecca's attorney went into damage control mode, trying to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that Rebecca had simply been trying to help the family, that she had not meant any harm. But the evidence was clear and damning. The deposition continued with questions about Rebecca's knowledge of my mother's finances and property. Marcus admitted that Rebecca had been obsessed with the topic, that she had spreadsheets tracking the estimated value of everything my mother owned, that she had made detailed plans for how they would use their inheritance. He testified that Rebecca had already spent money they did not yet have, making large purchases on credit in anticipation of the windfall. He admitted that their financial situation was precarious, that they were carrying significant debt, that Rebecca had taken out loans without his full knowledge or consent. When asked about his relationship with me during my mother's illness, Marcus started crying. He testified that I had been amazing, that I had done everything humanly possible to make our mother comfortable, that I had given up my entire life for 3 years. He said he felt guilty every single day for not helping more, for leaving the burden entirely on my shoulders. He said that when I had asked him for help, when I had begged him to come visit more often or to give me a break from caregiving, he had wanted to, but Rebecca had always talked him out of it. He said he had been a coward and a terrible son and an even worse brother. The attorney asked if Marcus believed I had manipulated our mother or exercised undue influence. Marcus's answer was immediate and emphatic. Absolutely not. Eleanor never asked our mother for anything. She never mentioned inheritance or money or what might happen after Mom died. She just loved her and took care of her. If anyone was trying to manipulate the situation, it was Rebecca, and I was too blind or too afraid to see it. Eleanor earned every penny she inherited through years of selfless sacrifice. I do not agree with my wife's decision to contest this will, and I want to publicly state that I believe my mother was completely competent and that her wishes should be honored. This testimony, coming from the person who theoretically had the most to gain from a successful will contest, essentially ended Rebecca's case. Her attorney tried to keep fighting, filing motion after motion, but the judge was losing patience. Finally, 6 months after my mother's death, The judge issued a ruling. He dismissed Rebecca's contest with prejudice, meaning she could not refile. He wrote a scathing opinion noting that the evidence showed my mother had been completely competent, that I had not exercised any undue influence, and that the only person who had attempted manipulation was Rebecca herself. He ordered Rebecca to pay all legal fees, which by that point had reached nearly $32,000, and he issued a restraining order preventing her from coming to my mother's house or contacting me directly for any reason. The judge's written opinion included several paragraphs that George said were highly unusual, essentially editorializing about the case. The judge wrote about how caregiving was undervalued in American society, how family members who sacrificed years of their lives to care for dying loved ones deserved recognition and compensation, how estate planning should reflect the realities of who actually provided care rather than defaulting to traditional inheritance patterns based on birth order or gender. He praised my mother's wisdom in creating a will that acknowledged and rewarded genuine devotion. He called Rebecca's behavior appalling and suggested that she seek therapy to address her obvious issues with greed and manipulation. I thought that would be the end of it, that we could finally move forward and begin healing. But Rebecca had one more card to play, and it was perhaps the cruelest thing she could have done. She convinced Marcus to cut off all communication with me completely. She told their sons, my nephews Jackson and Tyler, that I was a terrible person who had stolen their inheritance, who had manipulated their grandmother, who did not deserve to be part of their family. She poisoned them against me so thoroughly that when I tried to reach out, when I sent birthday cards and Christmas presents, everything came back unopened with return to sender written on the packages. Jackson was 14 and Tyler was 11, old enough to understand what was happening but young enough to still be completely under their mother's control. I had been a significant part of their lives before my mother got sick, had babysat them regularly, had attended their sports games and school concerts, had taken them on special aunt and nephew outings. We had shared inside jokes and favorite activities, and they had told me countless times that I was their favorite aunt. Now they would not even acknowledge my existence. I tried everything I could think of to reach them. I sent messages through mutual friends. I showed up at one of Jackson's baseball games and tried to approach him afterward, but Rebecca saw me and caused a scene, screaming that I was harassing her family and threatening to call the police. I wrote them letters explaining my side of the story, trying to help them understand that I had not stolen anything, that I had simply been there when their grandmother needed someone. But I had no way of knowing if they ever received the letters or if Rebecca intercepted them. The rejection from my nephews hurt worse than anything else Rebecca had done. I could handle her hatred and her legal attacks and her attempts to paint me as a villain. But watching two children I loved being taught to hate me, being fed lies about my character and my actions, was almost more than I could bear. I spent many nights crying over the loss of those relationships, mourning the boys who used to run to hug me when I arrived, who used to beg me to tell them stories and play games with them, who used to tell me their secrets and ask my advice about school and friends and life. For several months after the will contest was settled, I fell into a depression. I had won legally, had been vindicated publicly, had secured the inheritance my mother wanted me to have. But I felt empty and alone, cut off from the only family I had left, haunted by Rebecca's accusations and the loss of my nephews. I moved through my days mechanically, going to the grocery store and paying bills and handling all the practical tasks of living, but feeling disconnected from everything and everyone around me. I had also not yet moved into my mother's house. It sat empty on Maple Street, all the furniture and belongings exactly as they had been, like a museum of my former life. I could not bring myself to go there for several weeks after the will was settled. Every time I drove past and saw the windows dark and the garden getting more overgrown, I felt a wave of grief and guilt. Grief for my mother and the life we had shared in that house. Guilt that I was not taking better care of the property she had entrusted to me. Finally, on what would have been my mother's 74th birthday, I forced myself to go back. I let myself in with my key and stood in the entryway breathing in the scent of the house, that particular combination of old wood and lavender and something indefinable that was just home. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar objects, remembering moments that had happened in these spaces. The living room where my mother had taught me to knit. The kitchen where we had baked cookies every Christmas. The dining room where we had gathered for family meals before everything fell apart. I went upstairs to my old bedroom, which my mother had kept exactly as I had left it when I moved out for college at 18. My old posters were still on the walls, my books still on the shelves, my desk still holding the framed photographs of high school friends whose faces I could barely remember now. It was like a time capsule of a girl who no longer existed, a girl who had believed the world was simple and fair, who had trusted that family bonds were unbreakable, who had not yet learned that love and sacrifice was sometimes met with cruelty and betrayal. I sat on my old bed and finally let myself really cry. Not the controlled tears I had shed during the legal proceedings, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of absolute exhaustion and grief. I cried for my mother and everything she had suffered. I cried for my father and the family we had been before he died. I cried for Marcus and the brother he used to be before Rebecca changed him. I cried for my nephews and the relationship we would probably never have again. And I cried for myself, for the years I had lost, for the life I had put on hold, for the loneliness that seemed to be my constant companion. When the tears finally stopped, I felt strangely lighter, like I had purged something toxic from my system. I washed my face in the bathroom sink and looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, maybe for the first time in months. I saw a woman who looked tired and sad but also strong, a woman who had survived something terrible and come out the other side. I thought about my mother's letter, about her insistence that I accept the inheritance without guilt, about her hope that I would use it to build the life I deserved. And in that moment, standing in my childhood bathroom in my childhood home, I made a decision. I would not let Rebecca's poison infect my heart. I would not let her cruelty define my future. I would not waste the gift my mother had given me by wallowing in depression and isolation. I would honor my mother's memory by doing exactly what she had hoped I would do, by finally living my own life, by pursuing my own dreams, by finding my own happiness. The next day I started making changes. I hired a cleaning service to deep clean the house from top to bottom. I hired a landscaping company to restore the garden to its former glory. I called contractors to get estimates on updating the kitchen and bathrooms while preserving the historical elements of the house that made it special. I started going through my mother's belongings methodically, keeping the items that held genuine meaning and donating the rest to charity in her name. I also made an appointment with a therapist who specialized in grief and family trauma. I had been so busy being strong and handling everything during my mother's illness and death that I had not properly processed my own emotions. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Morrison, helped me work through years of accumulated grief and resentment. She helped me see that I was not responsible for Rebecca's behavior or Marcus's choices, that I could only control my own actions and responses. Through therapy, I started to understand the dynamics that had been at play in my family for years. Marcus had always been the golden child, the firstborn son, the one who was supposed to carry on the family legacy. When he married Rebecca, she had tapped into that sense of entitlement, feeding his belief that he deserved special treatment and special privileges. My role had always been the supportive daughter, the helper, the one who quietly took care of things without expecting recognition. This dynamic had set us up for exactly the kind of conflict that had erupted after my mother's death. Dr. Morrison helped me see that my mother's will had actually been an act of radical love and truth-telling. She had refused to perpetuate the family dynamic that undervalued my contributions and overvalued Marcus's mere existence. She had looked at the reality of who had been there for her and who had not, and she had made her decisions accordingly. This was not manipulation or favoritism, it was honesty and justice. I also started going back to school to finish the degree I had abandoned when my father got sick. I enrolled in night classes for a master's in social work, specializing in elder care and caregiver support. I had discovered during my mother's illness that there were almost no resources for family caregivers, no support systems or guidance or acknowledgement of how difficult and isolating the work was. I wanted to change that, wanted to help other people navigate what I had gone through, wanted to turn my painful experience into something meaningful. The work was challenging but fulfilling in a way nothing else in my life had ever been. I was using my own experience to help others, and I found that sharing my story and hearing other caregivers' stories was healing for everyone involved. I connected with people who understood the exhaustion, the guilt, the strange mix of love and resentment that could accompany caregiving. I learned that I was not alone in my experiences, that countless other people had sacrificed years of their lives to care for dying loved ones while the rest of the family stayed conveniently absent. As I got more involved in the caregiver community, I started advocating for better support systems and recognition. I testified before the state legislature about the need for caregiver tax credits and support services. I wrote articles for online publications about the hidden costs of family caregiving. I started a blog sharing my own story and providing practical advice for others in similar situations. The response was overwhelming. I received hundreds of messages from people thanking me for speaking up, for making them feel less alone, for validating their experiences and sacrifices. About a year after my mother's death, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Marcus, his voice quiet and strained, asking if we could meet for coffee. My first instinct was to say no, to protect myself from more pain and disappointment. But something in his voice made me hesitate, a quality I had not heard in years, something like humility or genuine regret. So I agreed, choosing a neutral location, a cafe downtown that neither of us had any history with. When I arrived, Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table looking smaller somehow than I remembered. He had lost weight, his face was drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed his hands were shaking as he gestured to the chair across from him. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, both of us not quite knowing how to begin, too much time and pain standing between us. Finally Marcus spoke, and the words came tumbling out in a rush. He said he was sorry, that he had been a terrible son and an even worse brother, that he had let Rebecca control every aspect of his life, including his relationship with his dying mother and his relationship with me. He said he had been in therapy for the past 6 months, working through his codependency issues and his lifelong pattern of avoiding conflict by letting others make his decisions. He said he had finally stood up to Rebecca, that they were separated and working toward divorce, that he had moved out and was living in a small apartment trying to figure out who he actually was without her voice in his head.